Welcome back. A resounding victory for political newcomer centrist Emmanuel Macron in France. The independent former investment banker set to become the next president of France after decisively defeating far-right candidate Marine Le Pen in his second round of voting in France. Joining us right now, senior fellow and the deputy director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Jeffrey Rathke. Jeffrey, good to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
So Macron's win, not just a defeat for the far right, but also the mainstream parties there in France, right? What's your takeaway on what took place?
Well, I think there are three big things that happened in this election. The first one is, by any measure, this was a landslide. Macron won over 65% of the vote, did 5 points better than even the most optimistic polls had predicted. So that's the first big message. The second message, as you say, it is a rejection of the far right. Marine Le Pen did worse than the polls suggested, and she did not capitalize on a lot of the kind of anti-system sentiment that was out there in the first round. So while she's got a lot of support, nowhere close to winning. And then the third story is the collapse of the traditional parties in France. The center-left especially, they got in the single digits, and also the conservative center-right did much worse than expected. So this is a very rapidly changing political landscape in France, and now at the head of it you've got a young newcomer with relatively little political experience, but who embodies a certain desire for change among the French electorate.
It's so fascinating. What do you think this means for the U.S.?
Well, what this means for the U.S. is, first of all, Macron will have a bit more momentum than people would have expected. The French president always has vast authorities for foreign affairs and for defense and security policy. So this is a partner the United States can work with. France is very active in fighting terrorism, in taking military action where it sees the need. So they've become an ever more important partner for the United States on the military side. Politically, I think Macron fits into, I guess you would say, the European mainstream. He's going to work closely with Angela Merkel in Germany, and I think they're going to hold the line on European-Russian policy, and so I think there's going to be continuity there.
So this is Lee Carter. I've got a question for you about, I mean, looking at this whole thing, I thought this is playing out the same way as it was in the U.S. We've got Le Pen being very similar to Donald Trump. And now thinking about it, they've just elected a businessman with little experience to solve the problems that they have. Do you think that's familiar? I know. Do you think that's going to be a theme moving forward?
Well, I think only to a limited extent. I mean, Macron certainly emphasized his background in the private sector, but he was also the economy minister for a while under the President Hollande's government. I think he is looking for centrist options rather than trying to dismantle the system. So I think that is going to be the main thrust. He wants to reduce public sector employment, but not by as much as some of the other candidates. He wants to reform the economy, but within, I think, a pretty centrist lane. So I don't think he's looking to totally remake France, as Le Pen certainly would have wanted to.
President Obama endorsed Macron. Does that in any way impact Macron's relationship with our President Trump?
I don't know. I think you'll have to ask the White House about that. I mean,
well, he did tweet congratulations to.
That's true.
By the way.
That's true. I think he hasn't telephoned him yet. It'll be interesting to see how quickly the two of them get on the phone and talk about what they see as the future for U.S.-French relations. I think it's important to remember, here, there are a couple of things that didn't happen that are pretty significant. The first is there was a terrorist attack just 2 weeks ago in the heart of Paris. Some people thought that was going to move the polls toward Le Pen and sort of a law and order vote. It didn't. Actually, they stayed right where they were. And then you had this big hack and dump of documents on Friday evening, right before the blackout period started, which doesn't seem to have moved the needle at all either. So you have to think also that if this was a Russian cyber attack, as Macron's campaign and some independent cyber security companies have said, that people in Moscow must be disappointed.
I'll just point out, though, that in 2 previous terror attacks, The one, I believe, was in Paris and then in Nice. That didn't move the polling numbers for Le Pen either. So there were some people who didn't expect her to get that big of a boost, and she didn't. It clearly didn't help her.
You know, I called France over the weekend and talked to colleagues and friends that are there. Violence is the biggest concern amongst locals, whether they be expats or nationals. And it's going to be got to be a top agenda item for the president-elect to deal with the violence, not just terrorism, just violence in general.
And a huge concern among tourists. Just anecdotally, anybody I've spoken to who normally would take a trip this time of year to Paris, to France, they're thinking twice about it.
Even just Europe in general.
Right. Absolutely.
So, Jeffrey, what about that? Is that going to be sort of the driving priority on his agenda?
Well, it's certainly going to be a top item on his agenda. You know, and France has been the victim of several terrorist attacks in recent years, and it has become, in some ways, part of a grim reality that the French public realizes is a real threat, and that's why you've got a huge deployment of French soldiers and gendarmes inside the country, and Macron has said he's going to increase defense spending and is going to take a tough line on terrorism. On the other hand, I think if you're talking about violence more generally, there hasn't been much history of, if you think about maybe disappointed National Front supporters, there hasn't been much of a tradition of that kind of violence. So I think the real focus is on the terrorist problem when you think about internal security in France, and so it's a real challenge.
All right, we'll leave it there. Jeffrey, good to talk with you. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.
Rathke,
bye-bye.
Joining us there. Up next.